Fleet Commodore Sale Thren had 11 minutes of fighting strength left in the Larathi home fleet, and she knew it the way a person knows the exact moment a wound has finally bled them past the point of recovery. Not from any single instrument reading, but from the accumulated, undeniable weight of every damage report crossing her tactical display in the last 6 hours. The Skarn hegemony had come for Larathis Prime with 400 warships, a force so far beyond anything the Larathi Star Reach had ever needed to field in 3 centuries of cautious defensive neutrality, that Thren's own admiralty had spent the invasion's opening day simply refusing to believe the sensor returns were accurate. They were accurate. The hegemony had spent a decade quietly building toward exactly this moment, annexing smaller powers along its border one methodical conquest at a time. And Larathis Prime, resource-rich, strategically positioned, defended by a fleet built for deterrence rather than survival, had always been in the hegemony's own long-term planning documents, simply a matter of scheduling. "Commodore, we've lost the steadfast vigil and the quiet resolve," her tactical officer reported, voice flat with the specific exhaustion of a woman who had stopped flinching at losses somewhere around hour 4. "That's the last of the second flotilla. We're down to homeworld defense platforms and whatever the Thren's hope can still put in the air." Thren did not correct the ship's name, though it had been named for her grandmother rather than herself, a coincidence of family naming conventions that felt, in this particular hour, like a cruelty she didn't have the strength to appreciate the irony of. "Signal all remaining defense platforms to concentrate fire on the hegemony's lead assault carriers. If we can't win this, we can at least make sure Larathis Prime's evacuation convoys have every extra minute we can buy them." It was, by any honest tactical accounting, a plan built entirely around losing with dignity, rather than winning, and every officer on Thren's bridge understood that, without needing to be told. The Larathi Star Reach had signed exactly one mutual defense treaty in 3 centuries of careful, deliberate neutrality, a modest, largely symbolic pact with a young, distant species called humanity, negotiated 11 years earlier, more as a diplomatic courtesy to a promising new arrival in the wider galactic community, than as any genuine expectation of military value. Humanity, at the time of the treaty signing, had possessed a colonial navy barely 3 decades old, still finding its footing among established powers who privately regarded the young species with the specific, condescending curiosity reserved for a newcomer. Nobody expected to matter for at least another century. Thren had sent the treaty activation signal 9 hours earlier, in the invasion's opening minutes. Not out of any real confidence that help would arrive in time, but because protocol demanded it, and because, in the particular desperation of a commander watching her fleet die by inches, even a largely symbolic gesture felt marginally better than doing nothing at all. She had not expected a response. Human space was, by the most optimistic transit estimates her own navigators could calculate, no closer than 11 days hard burn from the Larathi Star Reach's border, and the hegemony's 400 warships were not going to grant Larathis Prime 11 more days. It was her sensor officer, a young lieutenant named Ves Idara, who had been on duty for 19 consecutive hours and was operating on the specific, ragged focus of a person too exhausted to feel anything but numb professionalism, who first flagged the anomaly that would, within the hour, rewrite everything the Larathi Star Reach believed it understood about the young species it had extended a courtesy treaty to 11 years earlier. "Commodore," Idara said, and something in her voice, not alarm exactly, but a specific disbelieving confusion, cut through the bridge's exhausted static. "I'm reading a single contact at the system's outer boundary. It just resolved out of transit signature, and I need you to look at this because I don't think my instruments are reading it correctly." Thren moved to the sensor station and found herself staring at a return that made no immediate sense against anything in the Larathi threat library, a vessel profile that registered by mass and configuration as something closer to a heavy command cruiser than a scout, moving at a transit exit velocity that should have torn a ship that size apart. Its drive signature carrying an energy signature unlike anything the Larathi Star Reach had ever catalogued from human space. "That can't be a human ship," Thren said. And she heard, even as she said it, the specific, brittle uncertainty of someone repeating a fact she had believed with total confidence 3 seconds earlier, and now, staring at the data in front of her, no longer entirely trusted. Human hull designs top out at a third that mass. Their drives don't produce that kind of signature. Run it again, Lieutenant. Confirm the reading. Idara ran it again. The reading held. Behind Thren, her second-in-command, a grizzled tactical veteran named Commander Vel Osric, who had served the Lirathi Star Reach fleet for over 30 years and had, in that time, developed a professional skepticism toward anything that arrived without a clean, verifiable explanation, leaned over the sensor station with the specific, cautious curiosity of a man who had learned to distrust good news arriving too conveniently. Commodore, with respect, I'd urge caution before we let ourselves hope this is what the activation signal promised. It could be hegemony deception, a captured or reverse-engineered hull meant to draw our remaining forces out of formation at exactly the moment we can least afford it. I've considered that, Thren said, though the specific tightness in her voice suggested she had considered it with rather less confidence than the statement implied. Run a full authentication check against the treaty's specified recognition codes. If it's a deception, I want to know before I let this crew feel a single moment of hope they can't afford to have taken away from them again. The authentication check took 90 seconds that felt, to everyone on Thren's exhausted bridge, considerably longer, and when it resolved, cross-referencing the contact's transponder signal against the 11-year-old defense treaty's sealed recognition codes with a precision that left no room for reasonable doubt, Osric's carefully maintained skepticism finally, visibly cracked. It's genuine, Commodore, he said quietly. Codes match exactly. And then, as both women watched in a silence that had gone suddenly, completely still across the bridge, the lone contact's transponder resolved into a clear identification signal, broadcasting on the exact frequency the 11-year-old defense treaty had specified for exactly this kind of moment. And behind it, filling the sensor grid one contact at a time faster than Idara's overwhelmed instruments could properly catalog them, came the fleet it was leading. This is the story of what the Lirathi Star Reach learned that day about a species it had spent 11 years quietly underestimating. The treaty between the Lirathi Star Reach and the Colonial Navy had been negotiated 11 years earlier by a Lirathi diplomat named Ambassador Vor Kesseri, who had approached the arrangement with the specific, unglamorous pragmatism of a career diplomat filling out his government's contingency planning rather than any genuine expectation the pact would ever matter. Humanity at the time was a curiosity, a species barely 3 decades into organized interstellar governance, still consolidating its own colonial holdings, still years away from fielding a navy that any established power considered worth the diplomatic effort of a full military alliance. Kesseri had negotiated a modest mutual defense pact specifically because it cost the Lirathi Star Reach almost nothing to sign, and offered, in the unlikely event humanity ever amounted to anything militarily, a useful ally on a distant, otherwise unremarkable frontier. What Kesseri had not known, and what almost no established power in that region of the galaxy had known, was that the Colonial Navy's public posture, cautious, defensively postured, visibly still finding its footing among established interstellar powers, had been, since roughly the same year the Lirathi Treaty was signed, a carefully maintained diplomatic fiction covering a considerably different reality unfolding behind it. The shift had begun 11 years earlier, in the aftermath of an engagement humanity's own military historians would later mark as the moment the Colonial Navy's leadership fundamentally reconsidered its long-term strategic posture. A border skirmish with a raiding coalition that had, through overwhelming numbers rather than any real tactical sophistication, nearly overrun a human colony before reinforcements arrived in time. The engagement itself had been a victory, narrowly won, but the after-action analysis that followed had produced a conclusion. Fleet Admiral Isabel Okonkwo Reyes, then a rising strategic planner within Colonial Navy Command, had argued before the full Admiralty with a bluntness that nearly ended her career before it properly began. "We survived because we got lucky with timing," she told the assembled Admiralty, in testimony that would later be declassified and taught, in heavily redacted form, at every Colonial Navy staff college for the next generation. "We are a young species in a galaxy full of powers who have had centuries, in some cases millennia, to build their military capacity. We cannot outproduce established empires through visible, incremental growth, because every visible ship we field invites exactly the kind of scrutiny and containment policy that keeps young powers permanently young. I am proposing something considerably less comfortable: that we maintain a modest, unthreatening public posture while building, quietly, in shipyards the wider galaxy has no reason to inspect closely, a reserve fleet capacity that no established power currently believes we possess. We do not announce this capacity. We do not use it for anything short of existential necessity. We hold it patiently until the day it becomes the difference between a colony surviving and a colony being erased. The Admiralty's initial response had been skepticism, bordering on outright rejection. The proposal required a level of sustained, decades-long institutional discipline that few military bureaucracies anywhere in the galaxy had ever successfully maintained, along with a public diplomatic posture that would require the Colonial Navy's own senior officers to consistently, deliberately undersell their own capability in every formal interaction with foreign powers. It was, several admirals argued in the sealed proceedings, a plan that asked an entire military institution to accept looking weaker than it was for possibly generations, on the theoretical promise of a moment that might never actually arrive. One admiral in particular, a decorated fleet commander named Admiral Torvin Halsey, who had built his own reputation on the Colonial Navy's early hard-won engagements against compact raiders, pressed Okonkwo Reyes directly in the sealed proceedings with an objection that would later be studied, alongside her own testimony, as one of the doctrine's most important stress tests before adoption. You're asking this Admiralty to accept a strategy that could take a decade or more to bear fruit, built on the assumption that no crisis will arrive before we're ready for it. What happens, Commander, if the crisis comes in year 3 instead of year 11? What happens to the colonies who need our full strength today, while we're quietly building toward a strength we won't reveal for years? Okonkwo Reyes had not flinched from the question, because she had anticipated it and prepared for it with the same rigor she brought to every element of the doctrine's proposal. Then we accept that risk consciously, Admiral, rather than accepting the certain, permanent risk of remaining perpetually outmatched by every established power who has centuries of head start on us. I'm not proposing we abandon conventional deterrence in the years the quiet fleet takes to mature. I'm proposing we build it in addition to, not instead of, our visible capacity, so that the visible fleet continues protecting what it can protect today, while the reserve capacity matures toward the day it becomes decisive. This is not a strategy without risk. It is the strategy that accepts the least risk of the available alternatives, once you account for what remaining visibly, permanently weak, actually costs a young species over the following century. The vote that followed passed by a margin of exactly 3 votes, a fact that would remain classified for over a decade. And Okonkwo Reyes would later say, in the one interview she ever gave discussing the doctrine's contentious adoption, that she had spent every year of the following decade quietly aware that 3 admirals' worth of institutional faith was a considerably thinner margin than she would have liked to build an entire strategic doctrine upon. It arrived 11 years later, in the form of a treaty activation signal from a species the Colonial Navy had signed a largely symbolic defense pact with, as one of dozens of similar modest agreements extended, in that era, to any smaller power willing to formalize relations with a species the wider galaxy still didn't take entirely seriously. Ambassador Vorkasari, the Larathi diplomat who had originally negotiated that pact, had retired from active diplomatic service 6 years before the hegemony invasion, settling into a quiet consulting role that, by his own private assessment, mattered considerably less to his government's actual strategic priorities than the newer, more prominent alliances his successors had spent the intervening years cultivating. He learned of the invasion from a public emergency broadcast, and spent its opening hours in the specific helpless frustration of a retired diplomat, watching a crisis unfold with no formal role left to play in addressing it. It was only when the news services began reporting the sudden, inexplicable appearance of an unclassifiable vessel at the system's outer boundary that Kasari allowed himself the cautious hope of a man recognizing, perhaps, his own decade-old handiwork finally proving its worth. "That's the treaty," he told his adult daughter, who had come to sit with him through the broadcast's most harrowing hours. his voice carrying a mixture of vindication and disbelief he hadn't expected to feel. "I signed that agreement because it cost us almost nothing and might someday matter. I never imagined might matter would look like this. You really believed 11 years ago that they'd amount to something worth this kind of faith?" his daughter asked, watching the same broadcast with the skepticism of a generation raised on considerably more aggressive assessments of humanity's continued relevance. Kessery considered the question with the same careful, unhurried precision that had defined his entire diplomatic career. "I believed they were honest, which is a considerably rarer quality in interstellar diplomacy than raw military capability. I didn't know what 11 years would make of that honesty. But I've found across a long career that a species willing to keep its word on something small is usually a species willing to keep its word on something large, when the moment finally arrives that tests the difference." Fleet Admiral Okonkwo-Reyes, considerably senior now than the rising strategic planner who had first proposed the doctrine that would come to be known, in the small circle of officers cleared to discuss it, simply as the Quiet Fleet, received the Lirathi activation signal at her own command post 11 light-years from the crisis, and made the decision that would, within the day, permanently alter the wider galaxy's understanding of exactly what humanity had spent 11 years quietly becoming. "Confirm the treaty terms," she told her staff, though she already knew them by memory, because she had personally reviewed every defense pact the colonial navy held on file in the years since the doctrine's adoption, precisely so that this exact moment, whenever and wherever it eventually arrived, would never catch her chain of command unprepared. "And signal Reserve Fleet Command. Tell them the day we built the Quiet Fleet for has arrived. It's time the galaxy found out what 11 years of restraint actually bought us." Captain Marcus Chen had commanded the UCS Herald's Promise for 4 years. A heavy command cruiser built in one of the colonial navy's most tightly compartmentalized shipyards, and had spent every one of those 4 years understanding, with the specific clarity of an officer entrusted with a genuine institutional secret, exactly what his ship represented and exactly how carefully that representation needed to be protected until the day it no longer did. The Herald's Promise was, by any honest tactical measure, considerably more capable than any vessel the colonial navy publicly acknowledged fielding. A design built from a decade of accumulated engineering advances, the colonial navy had deliberately declined to showcase in any diplomatic or trade context, crewed by officers selected specifically for their ability to maintain absolute operational security about a program most of them had spent years working within before ever being told its full scope. Chen had been recruited into the Quiet Fleet program 8 years earlier, plucked from a promising but unremarkable career in conventional fleet operations by a recruiter who had told him in the recruitment interview that changed the trajectory of his entire career. Exactly one sentence about what he was being asked to sign on to. "We're building something the galaxy doesn't get to see until the day it needs to," the recruiter had said. "Everything before that day is patience. Can you do patience, Lieutenant Chen?" Chen had spent 8 years proving that he could, rising through the Quiet Fleet's tightly compartmentalized command structure to his current post as the lead vanguard captain for exactly the kind of contingency the program had always been built around. The sudden urgent activation of a treaty obligation that required not a slow, conventional deployment, but an immediate, overwhelming response calibrated to arrive before an ally's defense collapsed entirely. The order reached him 4 hours after Thren's activation signal crossed Fleet Admiral Okonkwo-Reyes's desk, transmitted through a communications relay chain the Quiet Fleet maintained specifically for moments like this one, and Chen read it twice before keying the shipwide comm, because the order represented in a single transmission everything 8 years of quiet, patient preparation had been building toward. "All hands, this is the captain. We have a treaty activation from the Lirathi Star Reach. Their homeworld is under active invasion by a hegemony assault force estimated at 400 warships, and their home fleet has been effectively destroyed. Reserve Fleet Command is mobilizing the full 3rd and 5th Quiet Fleets to relief posture, transit time approximately 6 hours at maximum safe burn. The Herald's Promise has been designated Vanguard. We arrive first, we confirm the tactical situation, and we hold whatever line needs holding until the main body arrives behind us." He paused, letting the weight of what came next settle across a crew who had spent years training for exactly this moment without ever quite believing it would come. 8 years, people. 8 years of nobody outside this program knowing what we actually are. That ends today. Let's make sure the galaxy's first look at the Quiet Fleet is one they remember for the right reasons. The Herald's promise reached maximum burn within minutes, her drive signature carrying the specific, distinctive energy profile that would, within the hour, register as an unclassifiable anomaly on Lirathi sensors, a transit velocity that exceeded every publicly known human vessel by a margin so significant that Chen's own tactical staff had spent years running simulations specifically to confirm the ship could survive the stresses of the approach without structural failure. Commander Priyavashti, Chen's executive officer and a veteran of the Quiet Fleet program's earliest recruitment class, watched the tactical display resolve their transit approach with the specific, focused calm of an officer who had spent 8 years preparing for a moment she'd genuinely begun to wonder if she'd ever live to see. "Captain, we're going to arrive well ahead of the main body, estimated 6-hour gap before the 3rd and 5th fleets reach the system." "I know," Chen said, "which means for 6 hours we're going to look to every sensor in that system, like a single ship arriving alone against 400 hegemony warships. I need this crew to understand exactly what that's going to look like from the Lirathi side, and exactly why it matters that we don't flinch from it." He turned to face his bridge crew directly, the particular unhurried gravity of a captain who understood that the next 6 hours would define how an entire galaxy remembered this moment. "We are not arriving to fight this battle alone. We are arriving to prove beyond any doubt that reinforcements are real and reinforcements are coming, and that a fleet commander watching her homeworld burn has exactly 1 hour left of despair before that despair becomes something else entirely. Helm, hold our transit heading. Let's go show them what 11 years of patience actually bought." The bridge crew of the Herald's Promise had trained together for the better part of 4 years, a specific, unusual cohesion for a colonial Navy vessel that most conventional career officers would have found strange if they'd ever been permitted to observe it. A crew who had spent years running simulation after simulation of exactly this scenario, the lone ship activation response, without ever quite believing the day would arrive when the simulation became reality. Lieutenant Halverson, the ship's young tactical officer, checked her own console readings for the 3rd time in as many minutes, not from any lack of confidence, but from the same ritual discipline that had carried colonial Marines and naval officers alike through countless engagements before this one. "Captain," she said, "for what it's worth, I've run this exact scenario in simulation 41 times since I came aboard. Never once thought I'd actually see it happen for real." "None of us did, Lieutenant," Chen said. "That was rather the point of the whole program. Now let's make sure the reality holds up as well as the simulation did." He glanced at Vashti. "Commander, signal Reserve Fleet Command one more time. Confirm the 3rd and 5th Fleet's transit timeline is holding steady, and confirm the activation order has reached every reserve shipyard in the sector. If Lyrathis Prime is the moment we've been building toward, I want to know every piece of that build is actually moving the moment we need it." Vashti's confirmation came back within minutes, carrying the specific, quiet satisfaction of 8 years of institutional discipline finally proving itself under genuine pressure, rather than simulated conditions. "Confirmed, Captain. Every reserve shipyard reports full activation. Admiral Okonkwo Reyes's flagship is already underway. We are, as far as Fleet Command can confirm, exactly where the doctrine always said we'd be at exactly this moment." Hegemony Fleet Admiral Draven Korsh had conquered 11 independent star systems in a 9-year career built on a single, ruthlessly consistent principle: overwhelming force, applied without hesitation against opponents whose military capacity had been thoroughly assessed and confirmed week before the first shot was ever fired. Lyrathis Prime represented, in his own private calculation, one of the more straightforward conquests of that career. A wealthy, defensively postured target whose only meaningful alliance, a largely symbolic pact with a distant, unproven human power, had never registered in Korsh's intelligence assessments as a variable worth serious concern. He had built that 9-year record from unglamorous methodical origins, rising through the hegemony's officer corps, not through any single dramatic victory, but through a specific, patient accumulation of smaller successful campaigns that had, over time, earned him a reputation as the fleet commander who never miscalculated an opponent's true strength. It was a reputation he had cultivated deliberately, understanding, better than most of his peers, that the hegemony's expansion depended as much on accurate intelligence and confident execution as on raw military capacity. And he had spent 9 years building an intelligence apparatus specifically designed to eliminate exactly the kind of uncertainty that had, until Lyrithus Prime, never once cost him a campaign. He received the report of an unidentified contact at the system's outer boundary, with the specific, dismissive irritation of a commander whose conquest, 6 hours from completion, did not need an unexplained anomaly, complicating an otherwise clean operational timeline. "A single ship," he said, reading the sensor summary his tactical staff had passed up the chain. "One vessel, against a hegemony fleet of 400 warships. Even if this is somehow a human relief force, and I remain skeptical of that classification, given the profile doesn't match any confirmed human hull design. One ship changes nothing about the outcome here today." His tactical officer, a cautious veteran named Commodore Yeth Draxus, who had served under Korsh for 6 of his 11 conquests, and had learned, across those campaigns, to voice concerns carefully rather than directly, chose his words with the specific diplomacy of a subordinate who suspected his commander's confidence might be running slightly ahead of the available intelligence. "Admiral, the drive signature doesn't match any human vessel in our threat library, not even the largest confirmed colonial navy designs. I'd recommend caution until we can classify the contact with greater confidence." "Caution," Korsh repeated with the specific, weary condescension of a commander who had heard this exact recommendation from cautious subordinates 11 times before, and watched, 11 times, his own decisiveness prove the caution unnecessary. "We have 400 warships and a homeworld 6 hours from full capitulation, Commodore. I did not build 11 conquests on caution. I built them on recognizing precisely when an anomaly matters and precisely when it doesn't. This one doesn't. Continue the assault. If the human vessel approaches within engagement range, destroy it, and let that serve as our answer to whatever this so-called relief effort believes it's accomplishing." What Korsh did not know, and what his 11 years of successful conquest had never given him reason to suspect, was that his entire operational doctrine had been built on an assumption the wider galaxy shared almost universally about a species it had spent decades deliberately, carefully allowed to appear less capable than it actually was. Every established power Korsh had studied in preparing this campaign, every intelligence assessment his staff had compiled on humanity's colonial navy, drew from the same public deliberately unremarkable posture the Quiet Fleet program had spent 11 years maintaining, precisely to produce exactly this kind of confident, catastrophic miscalculation in exactly this kind of commander. Aboard the Herald's Promise, 4 hours into her solitary approach, Captain Chen watched the hegemony fleet's tactical disposition resolve on his own sensors with the specific, grim satisfaction of a commander watching an enemy walk precisely into the shape of a plan built for them 11 years before they'd ever encountered it. Korsh's 400 warships remained fully committed to Lyrithus Prime's orbital bombardment, their formation showing no meaningful adjustment for the approaching contact beyond a small forward picket screen. A defensive posture built by a commander who genuinely did not believe a single ship represented a threat worth reorganizing an entire invasion fleet around. "They're not repositioning," Vashti reported, disbelief coloring her otherwise professional tone. "Captain, they're treating us like we're not even worth the fuel to adjust formation for." "Good," Chen said. "Let them keep believing that for exactly as long as it takes the rest of the fleet to arrive behind us. Signal Reserve Fleet Command. Confirm our transit timeline is holding, and confirm Commodore Thren's forces are still capable of holding position for the duration." Fleet Commodore Thren, watching the same tactical picture unfold from Lyrithus Prime's rapidly diminishing home fleet command post, found herself staring at a single human warship holding a steady, unwavering approach vector directly toward 400 hegemony vessels, and felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in the invasion's brutal opening hours. Not certainty, not yet, but the first genuine flicker of a possibility she had stopped believing in sometime around hour 6. "Lieutenant Idara," she said quietly, "hail that ship. I want to know exactly what we're looking at, and I want to know it before I let myself believe it's what I think it is." The hail reached the Herald's Promise 5 hours and 40 minutes into her solitary approach, close enough now to Lyrathis Prime's beleaguered defense line that Chen's sensor suite could resolve, in stark and painful detail, exactly how much the Lyrathi home fleet had already lost. A scattering of drifting hulks, a handful of defense platforms still fighting with the specific grim determination of forces that had long since stopped expecting to survive the engagement, and at the center of it all the Thren's hope. Her hull scarred but still holding position, still fighting. Chen opened the channel himself, because 8 years of quiet fleet doctrine had prepared him for exactly this moment, and because he understood, with the same clarity, Fleet Admiral Okonkwo Reyes had carried into her own career-defining testimony 11 years earlier, that the words spoken in the next 30 seconds would matter considerably more than any tactical maneuver the Herald's Promise alone could execute against 400 warships. "Lyrathi vessel, this is Captain Marcus Chen, Colonial Navy vessel Herald's Promise. I understand this contact reads unlike anything in your threat library, and I understand you have every reason to be uncertain what you're looking at. I'm going to make this simple. 11 years ago, your government signed a mutual defense treaty with a young species you had every reasonable cause to consider militarily unremarkable. Today, that species is telling you the truth about what 11 years actually bought you. I am the vanguard of the Colonial Navy's 3rd and 5th fleets, currently 6 hours out at maximum burn. I did not come here to fight this battle alone, Commodore. I came here to make sure you knew, beyond any doubt, that you were no longer fighting it alone either." The silence on the other end of the channel lasted 4 full seconds, long enough that Chen wondered if the transmission had somehow failed to fully resolve, before Thren's voice came through, steady, but carrying an unmistakable weight of emotion that 11 hours of unbroken crisis command had not managed to fully suppress. "Captain Chen," she said, "forgive my directness, but my sensor officer insists your vessel's specifications don't match any confirmed human hull design in our records, and I find myself needing to ask a question I never expected to need an answer to in my career. What exactly has your species been building for the last 11 years? "Patience, Commodore," Chen said, and there was something almost gentle in the way he said it, the specific, quiet satisfaction of a man finally permitted to speak plainly about a secret he'd guarded faithfully for 8 years. "We've been building patience, and everything patience made possible behind it. You're about to see exactly how much of both." Aboard the Hegemony flagship, Fleet Admiral Korsh received the intercepted transmission with the first genuine crack in his 11-year record of unbroken confidence, because a single human vessel calmly announcing itself as the vanguard of 2 full fleets was not the kind of claim any commander, however dismissive of an anomaly, could afford to simply disregard. "Recalculate the threat assessment," he ordered, his voice carrying none of the earlier dismissiveness. "If that transmission is accurate, I want to know exactly what a Colonial Navy fleet designation actually represents in real strength, and I want the answer before whatever 6 hours out actually arrives." Commodore Draxus delivered the analysis 11 minutes later, and the specific, disciplined restraint in his voice did nothing to soften the impact of what he'd found. "Admiral, we have no confirmed intelligence on Colonial Navy fleet-scale deployments of this kind. Every prior engagement record we hold shows human forces operating in formations consistent with the modest capacity we've always assessed them at. If this vessel's specifications are genuine, and if it truly represents merely the vanguard of a larger force, we may be facing a capability gap in our intelligence considerably larger than anything we've encountered in 11 years of campaign planning." Korsh absorbed that for a long moment, running the same specific, uncomfortable recalculation that every overconfident power in this story had eventually been forced to run against a species that had spent decades deliberately, patiently allowing itself to be underestimated. "Then we finish this before the rest of it arrives," he said finally, the decisiveness that had built 11 conquests reasserting itself even as the ground beneath it had just, for the first time in his career, begun to genuinely shift. "All ships, redirect fire. Destroy that vessel before it can confirm whatever it's actually leading. I will not let one ship's bluff cost me a conquest 6 hours from completion. 20 hegemony warships broke from the main invasion force and turned toward the Herald's Promise, with the specific, overwhelming intent of a fleet commander determined to erase an uncertainty before it could become a genuine threat. And aboard the lone colonial navy vessel, Captain Chen watched the tactical picture resolve with the particular focused calm of a man who had spent 8 years training for a scenario his own command staff had run in simulation, more times than he could easily count. 20 ships incoming, Vashti reported, her voice steady despite the mathematics of the engagement facing them. Captain, that's a strike group built to overwhelm us through sheer volume of fire. Our shields are rated for considerably more than anything in the standard hegemony arsenal. But 20 ships firing in concert is a different equation than anything we've tested in simulation. Then let's find out if 8 years of theory holds up against reality, Chen said. And there was no bravado in it. Only the specific, grounded confidence of a captain who trusted the ship beneath him and the crew around him because he had spent nearly a decade personally verifying every reason he had to trust them. Helm, evasive pattern theta. Weapons, target their lead elements, shield generators. I want this engagement to demonstrate exactly what a quiet fleet vessel can do, not just survive an assault we've already calculated we can weather. What followed across the next 6 minutes would become the single most replayed engagement footage in colonial Navy history within the year, studied at academies across human space not merely for its tactical outcome, but for what it revealed, for the first time publicly, about exactly how far the gap had grown between the colonial Navy's careful public posture and its actual accumulated capability. The Herald's Promise's shields, built from technology the colonial Navy had spent a decade deliberately withholding from any diplomatic showcase, absorbed the concentrated fire of 20 hegemony warships with a resilience that Chen's own tactical staff had genuinely doubted, in their more cautious private moments would translate cleanly from simulation to reality. Her weapon systems, similarly withheld from public demonstration for the entirety of the Quiet Fleet program's existence, answered with a precision and rate of fire that reduced the hegemony strike group's cohesion within the engagement's first 90 seconds. Not the overwhelming, indiscriminate destruction of a superweapon, but the specific controlled devastation of a vessel designed by engineers who had spent a decade solving exactly the tactical problems a single ship facing overwhelming numbers would eventually need solved. Lieutenant Halverson called out targeting solutions with a calm, practiced cadence that belied the mathematics of the engagement, prioritizing the strike group's escort vessels first to strip away the coordinated fire support that gave the larger hegemony formation its cohesion, then pivoting to the lead assault ships once the formation began, predictably, to fracture under the loss of its supporting elements. Lead elements' shields failing, Captain. Recommend we press the advantage before they can reorganize. Press it, Chen confirmed. Vashti, keep an eye on our own reserves. I don't want us so focused on this strike group that we miss the main fleet repositioning against us. Main fleet's showing no meaningful adjustment, Captain, Vashti reported, a note of genuine surprise entering her otherwise disciplined voice. They're still fully committed to the Larathi's prime bombardment. Whoever's commanding that fleet either doesn't believe we're a threat worth full attention, or hasn't processed what's happening to his strike group fast enough to react. Then let's make sure he processes it before this is over, Chen said. 6 hegemony warships were disabled or destroyed in the engagement's opening 2 minutes. 4 more followed in the third. By the time Korsh's strike group commander, watching his own tactical display collapse into a picture he had no framework to properly process, ordered a general withdrawal at the engagement's 5-minute mark, the Herald's Promise had reduced a 20-ship assault force to a scattered, retreating remnant. Her own hull intact, her own crew unharmed, her own captain already turning his attention back to the transmission he'd promised the Larathi star reach he'd deliver. Commodore Thren, Chen said, opening the channel again as the last of the hegemony strike group broke off. I imagine that answers at least part of your question about what my species has been building. I'd encourage you to hold your remaining position a little longer. The rest of the answer is about to arrive. Aboard Larathis Prime's command post, the 6 hours between the Herald's Promise's decisive engagement and the main body's arrival stretched with a specific, unbearable tension that Thren's exhausted crew had no easy way to fill. The hegemony's main invasion force, still fully committed to the homeworld's bombardment, continued its assault with undiminished intensity, and Thren found herself facing the particular, cruel arithmetic of a commander who now had genuine reason to hope, but whose remaining forces still needed to survive long enough for that hope to matter. "Commodore," Lieutenant Idara said, some 3 hours into the wait, her voice carrying the specific fragility of someone running on fumes, but refusing to let it show in her work. "We've lost 2 more defense platforms. I don't know how many more we can absorb before—" "Before what, Lieutenant?" Thren asked, not unkindly, because she understood exactly what Idara had stopped herself from saying, and understood, too, that saying it aloud would serve no purpose except deepening a fear that discipline alone was keeping at bay across her entire remaining command. "We have a confirmed relief fleet 6 hours out, and a ship that just proved, beyond any doubt, that the claim behind it is real. Our job for the next 3 hours isn't to win this battle alone. It's to still be here when the rest of the answer arrives. Concentrate remaining fire on protecting the evacuation convoys. Every platform we lose protecting civilians is a platform well spent. Every platform we lose trying to win a battle we don't need to win alone anymore is a waste we can't afford." Commander Osric, watching the tactical display's steady, grinding attrition with the same weathered patience that had carried him through 30 years of naval service, offered the specific, dry reassurance that only a veteran of his experience could deliver credibly in a moment this fragile. "I've served under 4 fleet commanders in my career, Commodore. Only one of them would have made that call as clearly as you just did, with this much on the line. For what it's worth, I think we're going to make it." The final 3 hours passed in a specific, grinding rhythm of small, costly victories. A defense platform holding position long enough to shield a departing evacuation convoy, a damaged corvette limping clear of the bombardment's outer edge. Small, hard-won margins that added up slowly to a homeworld still standing when the sensor grid finally began registering the first contacts of the 3rd and 5th Quiet Fleet's arrival. Aboard the Hegemony flagship, Fleet Admiral Draven Korsh watched the wreckage of his own strike group's retreat, with the specific, hollow understanding of a man whose 11-year record of confident, decisive conquest had just collided in a single 6-minute engagement with a variable his intelligence had never once flagged as possible. He had built his entire career on the principle of accurately assessing an opponent's capability before committing to an engagement. He understood, watching the Herald's promise hold position, unscathed, at the edge of a system he had believed 6 hours from full capitulation, that his assessment of humanity had been wrong in a way that no single engagement was going to let him quietly correct. "Admiral," Commodore Draxus said, his voice carrying the particular careful restraint of an officer delivering news he already knew his commander would not want to hear. "Sensor sweep from the outer boundary. Multiple large contacts resolving out of transit. I'm reading." He paused, running the count a second time before continuing, because the number felt, even to him, too large to report with confidence on a first pass. "I'm reading in excess of 200 additional vessels, Admiral, and the count is still climbing." The 3rd and 5th Quiet Fleets arrived at Lerathis Prime, 6 hours and 11 minutes after Fleet Admiral Okonkwo Reyes gave the order that ended 11 years of institutional patience, resolving out of transit in a formation that no sensor grid anywhere in hegemony space had ever been calibrated to properly register. 240 warships, built across a decade in shipyards the wider galaxy, had no reason to inspect closely, crewed by officers who had spent years training for a moment they had genuinely begun to wonder if they would ever see arrive. Aboard the Resolute Testament, Fleet Admiral Okonkwo Reyes stood at her own command station watching the fleet's arrival formation resolve with a specific, private emotion she permitted herself exactly long enough to acknowledge before folding it back into the discipline 11 years of command had built into her. She had staked her entire career, at 31 years old and barely established in the Colonial Navy's Strategic Planning Corps, on a doctrine that 3 admirals' worth of thin institutional faith had approved by the narrowest possible margin. She had spent 11 years since watching that doctrine mature in near total secrecy, uncertain, in her more honest private moments, Whether the moment it was built for would ever actually arrive before political pressure, or simple institutional fatigue eventually unwound the whole careful architecture of restraint. It had arrived. And watching 240 warships resolve into formation above a homeworld her doctrine had just saved from erasure, Okonkwo Reyes found herself thinking, briefly, of Admiral Halsey, the officer who had pressed her hardest in the doctrine's original sealed proceedings, and who had died 4 years earlier without ever living to see whether his skepticism or her confidence had been the more accurate assessment. "I wish you'd lived to see this, old friend," she said quietly to no one in particular, before turning her full attention back to the tactical display and the 90 minutes of engagement still ahead of her fleet. Aboard Lyrathis Prime's command post, Fleet Commodore Sael Thren watched the tactical display resolve, contact by impossible contact, and felt the specific, overwhelming vertigo of a commander who had spent the last hour permitting herself, cautiously, to hope, now watching that hope confirmed at a scale her own intelligence assessments had never once considered possible for a species 11 years into a courtesy treaty. Nobody in her government's admiralty had ever expected to genuinely matter. "That can't be a human fleet," she said, and heard, even as she said it, the same brittle disbelief that had colored her first assessment of the Herald's promise 6 hours earlier. A fact she had believed with total confidence collapsing, for the second time in a single day, against evidence she could no longer reasonably dispute. "Commodore," Lieutenant Idara said quietly, her own voice carrying the specific awed exhaustion of 19 consecutive hours finally arriving somewhere other than despair. "I think it very much is." The Hegemony Fleet's response to the Quiet Fleet's arrival unfolded across the following 90 minutes, in a pattern that colonial Navy tactical historians would study for a generation. Not a single decisive engagement, but the specific cascading collapse of an invasion force built entirely around the assumption of overwhelming numerical superiority, now confronted with an opposing fleet whose actual capability had been so thoroughly concealed for so long that Korsh's own tactical staff had no reliable framework for calculating what they were actually facing. The engagement's opening phase saw the Quiet Fleet's vanguard elements establish a defensive perimeter around Lyrathis Prime's remaining evacuation convoys, a deliberate tactical priority that Fleet Admiral Okonkwo Reyes had specified in her pre-engagement orders precisely because she understood, from years studying the doctrine's theoretical applications, that a relief fleet's first responsibility was protecting what remained rather than immediately pursuing an aggressive, casualty-heavy offensive against a numerically superior but demoralized enemy. It was a choice that cost the engagement additional minutes the Hegemony Fleet might otherwise have used to reorganize, but which Thren, watching from her own command post, recognized immediately as the specific mark of a fleet that had trained not merely for victory, but for the responsible exercise of the strength it had spent a decade quietly accumulating. "They're shielding our convoys before they're even engaging the main force," Osric observed, a note of genuine admiration entering his weathered voice. "That's not the tactic of a fleet trying to prove a point, Commodore. That's the tactic of a fleet that's already decided what winning actually means to them." "Then let's hope the rest of the engagement matches that promise," Thren said, though her own voice had, for the first time in 9 hours, lost the specific brittleness that crisis command had worn into it. Commodore Draxus, watching the same engagement unfold from the considerably less favorable vantage of the Hegemony flagship, delivered a running series of increasingly grim tactical updates to an admiral whose 11-year record of unbroken conquest was collapsing in real time against a capability gap his own intelligence apparatus had never once flagged as possible. "Admiral, we're losing cohesion across 3 separate formation elements. Their weapons range and shield capacity both exceed our tactical assumptions by a margin I don't have a clean explanation for." "I don't need an explanation, Commodore," Korsh said, his voice carrying the specific hollow strain of a commander watching 11 years of carefully built reputation collapse faster than he could process the loss. "I need a path that doesn't end with this fleet destroyed entirely. Report." "If we hold position and continue engaging, current attrition rates suggest total fleet loss within the hour," Draxus said, delivering the assessment with the careful, professional restraint of an officer who understood exactly how unwelcome the news was, and delivered it anyway because the alternative, allowing his commander to make a catastrophic decision on incomplete information, represented a failure of duty he was not willing to accept. If we withdraw now, we preserve approximately 2/3 of our remaining fleet strength. At the cost of abandoning the conquest entirely, Fleet Admiral Isabel Okonkwo Reyes commanded the Quiet Fleet's arrival personally from her own flagship, the Resolute Testament, and opened a single, brief channel to the hegemony's command frequency before the engagement's opening exchange, delivering a message with the specific, unhurried gravity of a commander who had spent 11 years waiting for exactly this moment to finally arrive. Hegemony Fleet. This is Fleet Admiral Isabel Okonkwo Reyes, Colonial Navy. 11 years ago, my government signed a defense treaty with the Lirathi Star Reach that most of the galaxy considered a diplomatic formality between an established power and a species nobody expected to matter for another century. You have spent the last 9 hours discovering exactly how badly that assessment aged. I am giving you one opportunity to withdraw your remaining forces from this system before this engagement becomes considerably less survivable for everyone still committed to it. What happens in the next 5 minutes is entirely your admiral's choice, but I want the historical record to reflect, clearly, that the choice was offered. Korsh did not withdraw immediately, because 11 years of unbroken conquest had built into him a specific, stubborn resistance to accepting defeat at the first sign of a reversed advantage, and the engagement's opening exchange, brief and one-sided in a way that would come to define the entire encounter, cost the Hegemony Fleet another 30 vessels before Korsh finally gave the order his own tactical staff had been quietly urging for the previous 10 minutes. "Full withdrawal," he said, the words costing him more than any single decision in 11 years of campaign planning. Watching his own carefully built reputation for decisive, ruthless conquest collapse in real time against a species his intelligence apparatus had spent a decade fundamentally, catastrophically misjudging. "Signal all remaining ships. We are not completing this conquest today." Aboard Lyrathis Prime's command post, Thren watched the Hegemony Fleet's retreat resolve across her tactical display, with a silence that carried more weight than any celebration could have. The specific, overwhelming stillness of a commander who had spent 9 hours preparing herself to lose everything, now confronting the considerably more disorienting reality of an unexpected, total survival. "Signal the Herald's Promise and the Quiet Fleet command vessel," she said finally, her voice carrying an emotion her 19-hour crisis discipline could no longer fully contain. "Tell them." She paused, searching for words that felt adequate to 11 years of quiet underestimation finally. Completely corrected. "Tell them Lyrathis Prime will remember exactly what a courtesy treaty turned out to be worth." The Battle of Lyrathis Prime, as it came to be formally recorded in every major galactic power's military history within a year of its conclusion, did not merely save a single allied homeworld from conquest. It fundamentally, permanently altered the wider galaxy's understanding of exactly what a young, carefully unassuming species might be quietly capable of, and the ripple effects of that single revelation traveled considerably farther and faster than even Fleet Admiral Okonkwo Reyes, architect of the Quiet Fleet Doctrine, had fully anticipated when she gave the order 11 years of preparation had been built toward. The hegemony's own government, confronting the loss of its most ambitious campaign in a decade alongside the specific, humiliating public revelation that its intelligence apparatus had entirely failed to detect the colonial navy's true capability, entered into a formal, if grudging, non-aggression framework with human space within the year, the first such formal treaty the hegemony had ever signed with a power it hadn't first conquered or been forced to negotiate with from a position of genuine parity. Fleet Admiral Draven Korsh, whose 11-year record of unbroken conquest had ended at Lyrathis Prime, was quietly retired from active command within months, his career's final chapter defined permanently by the specific uncomfortable lesson. Every overconfident power in this story eventually learned about mistaking a species' careful restraint for an accurate measure of its actual strength. Every other established power that had, over 11 years, extended humanity the same condescending, dismissive courtesy the Lirathi Star Reach had once shown in negotiating its own modest defense pact, found itself, in the months following Lyrathis Prime, urgently reassessing the actual value of whatever agreements it held with a species the wider galaxy had, collectively, comfortably underestimated for a full decade. Diplomatic overtures poured into colonial navy channels at a volume the colonial navy's still modest diplomatic corps had never remotely prepared to handle. And Fleet Admiral Okonkwo Reyes found herself in the strange, unfamiliar aftermath of a doctrine finally proven correct, advising an entirely new generation of colonial diplomats on how to manage a reputation that had shifted, almost overnight, from unremarkable newcomer to a power every established government suddenly wanted, formally, publicly allied with. The shift proved in its own way as delicate to manage as the 11 years of restraint that had preceded it. Several colonial navy strategists argued, in the months following Larathis Prime, for a more aggressive public posture, now that the quiet fleet's existence could no longer be reasonably concealed. A full accounting of the program's true scale, delivered publicly, to establish humanity's position among the galaxy's recognized major powers, beyond any further doubt. Okonkwo Reyes resisted that pressure with the same careful discipline that had defined her entire career, arguing before a considerably more receptive admiralty than the one that had approved her original doctrine by 3 votes 11 years earlier. "We have proven what needed proving," she told them. "We do not need to prove it again, louder, to every power who wasn't paying attention the first time. A reputation for keeping quiet, decisive promises is worth considerably more over the long run than a reputation for loud declarations of strength. Let Larathis Prime speak for itself. Let the next crisis, if one ever comes, speak for itself as well. We built this doctrine on patience. I see no reason to abandon that discipline the moment patience finally pays off." The Admiralty this time did not need 3 votes to be convinced. The vote in favor of Okonkwo Reyes's continued restraint passed nearly unanimously, a fact she noted, in her own private reflections years later, as the single clearest evidence that the institution she had spent her career building had genuinely internalized the doctrine's deepest lesson, not merely that patience could produce decisive strength, but that the discipline required to wield that strength wisely mattered just as much as the strength itself. Captain Marcus Chen returned to a considerably more public career than 8 years of quiet fleet secrecy had ever prepared him for, though he found, in the years that followed, that he preferred the quieter recognition of the crew who had served with him through the engagement's 6 most decisive minutes over any formal ceremony. The Colonial Navy's Public Relations Office wanted to build around his name. He gave, eventually, exactly 1 public address about the engagement, delivered at the Colonial Navy Staff College to a graduating class of officers who would go on to lead the next generation of a Navy no longer required to hide its true capability behind 11 years of careful restraint. The hardest part was never the 6 minutes of fighting, he told them. The hardest part was 8 years of nobody outside a small, trusted circle, knowing what we actually were, while the entire galaxy assumed they already had us figured out. Restraint that looks like weakness to an outside observer is still restraint, not weakness. And the day finally came when the difference mattered more than anything else we'd ever trained for. I'd encourage every one of you to remember that the next time patience feels like it's costing you something, sometimes it's just quietly building the thing that eventually changes everything. Commander Priya Vashti, promoted to her own command within 2 years of the engagement, made a point throughout her subsequent career of personally interviewing every officer recommended for the Quiet Fleet's Next Generation Successor program, a practice she began specifically because she remembered vividly the particular weight of Chen's original recruitment interview and the specific kind of institutional trust it had demanded of her at the very start of her own career. "We're not just building ships anymore," she told incoming candidates in a version of the same speech she delivered dozens of times over the following decade. "We're building the next generation's version of a promise that took 11 years to pay off once already. That kind of promise only works if the people carrying it actually understand what they're signing up to protect, and why the waiting matters as much as the eventual reveal." Lieutenant Yuki Halverson, whose calm, precise targeting solutions had anchored the Herald's Promise's decisive 6-minute engagement, was offered a promotion to her own tactical command within the year, and declined it twice before finally accepting a posting that kept her, by her own explicit request, aboard a quiet fleet vessel rather than a conventional colonial navy command. "I spent 4 years training for exactly 1 engagement," she told a journalist, who pressed her some years later about the unusual career choice. "I'd like to spend the next several years training for whatever comes after it, with the same crew who made the first one work. Some things are worth staying for, even when the promotion board keeps insisting you should want something else." Fleet Commodore Sale Thren, whose home fleet had been reduced to a handful of surviving vessels by the time the Herald's Promise first appeared on her sensors, spent the years following Lyrathis Prime rebuilding the Lyrathi Star Reach's military doctrine from the ground up, incorporating at her own explicit insistence a considerably more rigorous framework for assessing Allied capability, rather than relying on the comfortable, convenient assumptions that had nearly cost her homeworld everything. She and Chen maintained a formal correspondence for years afterward, and the final line of her own memoir, published a decade later, borrowed directly from a conversation the two of them had shared in the exhausted, disbelieving hours immediately following the hegemony's withdrawal. Lieutenant Ves Idara, who had spent 19 consecutive hours on duty before first flagging the anomalous contact that changed everything, was promoted twice in the years following Lyrathis Prime, eventually taking command of the Lyrathi Star Reach's newly established long-range sensor and early warning division, a posting she pursued specifically because she never wanted another commander in her fleet to face the same disbelieving, 19-hour uncertainty she had faced in the invasion's final hours. "I want the next crisis to arrive with better information than I had," she told a colleague years later, in an interview reflecting on her career's unusual trajectory. "Whatever comes next, whoever it comes from, I want us to know exactly what we're looking at faster than I managed that day." Commander Vel Osric, the weathered veteran whose steady, dry reassurance had helped hold Thren's command post together through the invasion's most desperate final hours, retired from active service within 2 years of the battle, choosing to spend his remaining career teaching tactical doctrine to a new generation of Lyrathi officers. He kept, in his personal quarters for the rest of his life, a small, informal keepsake, a data chip containing the Herald's Promise's final transmission before the Quiet Fleet's main body arrived, which he would play, on request, for any student who asked him what it had actually felt like to watch a single human ship hold position against 400 warships and simply refuse to move. It felt like watching someone keep a promise nobody expected them to remember making, he told them every time. "I've served 30 years in this fleet. I've never seen anything else quite like it, before or since." The final line of Thren's own memoir, published a decade later, borrowed directly from a conversation the two of them had shared in the exhausted, disbelieving hours immediately following the hegemony's withdrawal. "We spent 11 years believing we understood exactly what we'd signed a treaty with. We were wrong about almost everything except one thing. They kept their word. In the end, that turned out to be the only assessment that actually mattered." The Lyrathi Star Reach's foreign ministry, in the years following the battle, established an annual commemoration on the anniversary of the hegemony's withdrawal, marked not by military parades or displays of strength, but by a considerably quieter tradition that Thren herself proposed in the ceremony's founding charter, a formal reading, before an assembly of Lyrathi and colonial navy officials both, of the original 11-year-old treaty text, word for word, unchanged, exactly as Ambassador Kessery had negotiated it in an era when neither government had any reason to expect it would ever matter beyond diplomatic formality. "We do not commemorate a battle," Thren said in her remarks at the first such ceremony. "We commemorate a promise, kept exactly as written, at a cost neither side fully understood when they agreed to it. I think that is worth remembering considerably more than the size of the fleet that eventually arrived to keep it."